All right, time to unset. How you doing today? How you feeling? That's enough small talk. Let's get after it. All right. Episode 16. Let's get into it. Let's go. My guest this week is a former hotshot firefighter, TEDx speaker, city council member, and the executive director of the Boise Bicycle Project. The organization is nationally known for its programs that serve incoming refugees, incarcerated individuals, and families experiencing homelessness. He created the Boise Goathead Fest, a community building event that's grown into one of America's largest bicycle festivals. In 2021, he took part in the planning and creation of 110 miles of walking and biking pathways across Boise. He's concise with his ideas on building community and modifying city infrastructures to better accommodate bicycles as solutions to city congestion and rising health issues. I hope you enjoy my conversation as much as I did with Boise City Councilman Jimmy Hallyburton. I'm thrilled you're here, Jimmy. If you can, just to get started, if you can just fill us in a little bit on your backstory or your origin story.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born in Boise, Idaho, and I actually grew up in the same house that my mom did. My grandpa built the house in the 50s. My mom grew up there, and then she sold it to my parents, and that's where I was born and raised, in that same house. And it's sort of on the outskirts of Boise and right next to a dairy farm. And this was in the 1980s, early 80s, and we always kind of joke around that Idaho is about 5 or 10 years behind everywhere else. But I sort of had this childhood that people think about where the rule is be home by dinner, and there's really not a lot of other rules, and you're just kind of wandering around as a kid throughout the neighborhood and getting into all sorts of healthy mischief, hopefully, and exploring around. And then it's just an unbelievable amount of freedom that I felt like I had as a kid. And for me, not only was I wandering around, but I was also always wandering around on a bicycle. And so for my entire life, my bicycle has sort of been this feeling of, or symbol of freedom and opportunity. I remember at a young age pedaling out of my dirt driveway for the first time and feeling like my entire world had expanded. At that point, it had sort of been contained to my front yard, my backyard, the horse pasture behind us. And as soon as I sort of broke free on two wheels, the world that I was exposed to suddenly had no limits to it anymore. So again, this bicycle sort of been this symbol for me for a long time. But so I grew up in this sort of rural dairy farm area, started fighting fires when I was in my 20s to put myself through college. A little ways into my firefighting career as a hotshot on the Idaho City Hotshots, I started coming up with an idea with one of the other firefighters for this nonprofit called the Boise Bicycle Project. Started that when I was about 25, and I've been running it for 15 years. And so that's, I guess, kind of a big portion of my life, 39 years condensed into a really small soundbite there.
No, that's awesome. But that gets us right to the point where I discovered you because of your TEDx talk in 2017 called The Speed of Discovery.
Oh yeah, the speed of discovery is sort of what I consider this magical speed of about 10 to 12 miles an hour, where you can move through the world at a somewhat decent pace, but not so fast that you can't actually observe and absorb the world around you. And yeah, I did that TED Talk. And if I could go back again, there's a couple of things that I would do a little bit differently, but it's funny, every once in a while, somebody like you or someone else hears it and there's something that resonates with them. And I think that it is that sort of that symbol of the bicycle. It's one of those things like food or art or music. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're from. This bicycle has this unique spot in your memory and this unique feeling that it's created for you. And so that TED Talk, it kind of makes its rounds every once in a while, and something pops up, and all of a sudden it gets a bunch more views, or I get a bunch more emails. And so I'm really glad that I did that. And I'm glad that it seems to still have this sort of lasting effect, even almost 10 years after I've done it.
Well, the reason it resonated with me is because the speed of discovery, and our worlds, yours and mine, connects even more because you're also a sailor. You have an experience with that. And so my wife and I spent the last 10 years living and cruising on a sailboat, which we always used the term the speed of discovery because we always said we discovered life at 6.5 knots, which is it's almost 7 miles an hour, 7.5 miles an hour, which is close to the bicycle. And I'm an avid cyclist as well. So that's what drew me to the talk when I was putting this podcast together for a way that we could talk about how, even in today's modern world, with everything that's going on with gas prices and inflation and all this social stuff that's going on, the bicycle, which is the simplest of simple, perfect inventions, can connect us to our communities and solve a lot of problems that we have with healthcare, people being unhealthy, cities overcrowded and congestion and that sort of thing. And it's kind of like I was trying to draw the correlation of how the bicycle has been around for 200 years and it can help affect all of this stuff. And then you were kind of the puzzle that completed it, because I found your talk and I thought, I thought it'd be really cool to talk to you almost 10 years after you did that talk and find out, because the Boise Bicycle Project, I mean, you guys, you have, and I don't know if this is still true, but you have 17 staff, you have 800 volunteers, and you've done over 17,000 bicycles. And what the cool thing about it is you place those bicycles, donate them into low-income families. And you've done over like 6,500 bicycles. Is that true?
Yeah, so we've donated this year. We actually donated our 10,000th bicycle to a kid in the community. We've distributed more than that because we fix up and we sell some of them at affordable prices, or we have ones that go to our adult programs as well for folks that are maybe getting out of prison or who arrived as refugees, or maybe they're experiencing homelessness. But yeah, this year, our 10,000th bicycle to a kid.
Awesome.
This little boy named Elise. And he arrived in Boise from El Salvador, doesn't speak hardly any English at this point. And the nonprofit that referred to him, referred him to us. They were really concerned just because he was so unhappy, and rarely unhappy for a kid, not really finding a lot of joy. And you have to imagine arriving in Boise, Idaho,
sure,
from El Salvador, and there's nothing that really looks familiar. People aren't speaking the same language. You probably fled a really scary situation, and you are entering a situation that, in a lot of ways is still just as scary. So they were really looking for something for him that created some sort of familiarity, something that made him feel at home, and something that, literally would bring a smile to his face. And so they connected in with us. We were able to get him this bicycle, and we had to work hard to get that smile out of him, but you could see it there. And there's sort of this, I observe it a lot, I've seen it happen over 10,000 times, but there's this look that these kids get in their eyes, and it's sort of a distant look. And you can kind of tell that they're not only thinking about the place that they're going to ride in that moment, the road in front of them, but they're starting to think about all the places that they're going to go. And in a kid's imagination, even as adults, that world all of a sudden begins to grow pretty big, and you start thinking about those possibilities. And when we got that bike to Elise, we saw that same sort of look in his eye, that same sort of shining look of like, this is going to take me somewhere important and somewhere away from some of the stress and some of the feelings that I'm having right now. So that was bike number 10,000. We know that every single kid that's referred to us, they all have these sort of similar stories, and some of them are more heartbreaking than others. Some of them touch our hearts in certain ways, but we know that each bike makes a difference. Beyond just being a toy, it's really something that can connect these kids to opportunities to grow. So number 10,000, and then you think about all the different kids who've gotten them over the years. Some of them, the kids that were 8 years old, 15 years later, now might have kids of their own. And so our bikes now are, potentially getting to second generation kids, which is pretty cool to think about.
It's really amazing to think about, actually, because Elise, as you touched on, probably fled an incredibly horrific situation, especially in El Salvador with what's going on down there right now. But the bicycle, at a time when you said like he came to Boise and he's probably still feeling, even though he's safe physically, he's probably still feeling some mental isolation because he doesn't speak the language. He looks different. The kids can be kind of tough on him. But when you give him that bicycle, the amazing thing about bicycles is, and you touched on it in your talk, was the freedom that you get. Like he might be feeling isolated, but now his helplessness is gone because he can get somewhere when he wants to take his mind out of something. He can now get on that bicycle and go do some discovering and exploring on his own and not feel that he's trapped, right? So when you give these kids these bicycles, most people or some people might see it as, oh, you're just giving them a bike. But in my eyes and a lot of other people's eyes, man, you're giving them the world, because as a bike traveler, I've ridden my bike all over the world, and you see things even in your own neighborhood. It's a connection. And to touch on that further, not to overspeak, but when I did some research for this talk, I started to find out about how, because when you think about bicycles, you think about the Dutch, the Netherlands, how they've managed their cycling community. Well, Dutch teens have the lowest rate of depression, lowest rate of obesity, lowest uses of antidepressants in the world. And I mean, they cycle 46 to 76% of their trips. I mean, it's correlative. What do you think is the biggest impediment to getting that to happen in America, to get a switch like that? Not even that on that magnitude, but maybe increased.
Yeah, it's so funny. Like, we know the impact that bicycles can have, and we know that that it can be transformative, for communities, for socioeconomic status, for health, for all these different types of things. Like, there's data that shows that we can do it out there, and it takes a commitment really to make that happen. And in some ways, it maybe takes a little bit of a sacrifice, but that sacrifice, I think a lot of times people think it's going to be hard or worse. People don't fear change, they fear loss. And so when people start thinking of like, oh, well, if I can't drive, I'm going to be there it's going to take me longer to get there. So they have like this idea of loss that maybe goes with substituting a car trip for a bicycle trip. But you don't also think about the positive things that you're going to get from that. So the positive aspects for your physical health, your mental health, the ability to be more in touch with the community around you, the ability to process the day before you get to where you're going to going, or processing the day after it takes place before you get home, and the importance of that transition period. And I think that what happens a lot of times is that people don't fully understand the benefits of a bicycle until they get back on it again. And once they get back on it again, they start to realize those same feelings that they remember from a kid, from childhood, they still have it now, and it starts playing an important role. And what you find is that when people start to make that shift, they oftentimes don't go back, because that fear of loss goes away, because they're gaining so much in exchange. And so I think it's a lot of times it's reminding people of what that feeling is like, and getting them back in touch with those different aspects. We do that a lot with political figures here in Idaho and Boise. If we want somebody to understand what it's like for these kids to ride bicycles, or the need for better bicycle infrastructure, we try to take them on a bike ride. We try to show them what it's like and what it feels like in these different areas. I think the other thing too is it's kind of what you're prioritizing, right? And so if you're prioritizing the urgent over the important, you're going to get cities that we see, like in America, where they prioritize driving cars versus the more important aspects of, really investing in the positive benefits that a bicycle can create against the negative effects that, riding in a car can take. And so I think that, we have to make sure that we are investing in long-term solutions. And a lot of times we're still addressing what's the most urgent at that moment, and sometimes the easiest thing to do, instead of the long-term change that we need. But if you looked at some of the Dutch cycling, if you looked at other areas around the world like Bogota, Colombia, that are shutting down during their cyclovia events, shutting down massive portions of their city to walking and biking only, all of a sudden you start seeing that the businesses are doing better, the people are happier. So it takes that sort of massive change and risk to be willing to take that political fallout that maybe is going to be there, to take a lane of a road away to add a bike lane, or to close streets so that they're open to the public. But time after time, Paris, all sorts of other places, New York City, you see that when they do it, it always has a positive benefit, but it's a pretty big risk to take that step.
Well, and that's a great segue into you're a city council member in Boise, correct? Still on the city council?
Still on the city council. I was elected in 2019. I was in office for 2 months before the pandemic hit, and I've been there ever since. So I've got about another year and a quarter left on my term, and then I'll have to decide whether or not I'm going to run again.
And that's interesting, because you got elected right before one of the most, I don't even know what the word to use, but the pandemic just changed so much in the world. And during your first tenure as a city council member, I can't imagine that it was easy. But to me, I haven't spent much time in Boise, but I have friends there. I have several friends there. Boise is on the forefront, I think, with like cities like Boulder, who have made the investment into changing their infrastructures. Because when you look at the data, and I mean, people always gloss over when you talk about numbers, but when you're trying to make a change in a community, the numbers are really what drives the motivation for the politics. Whereas the people are just, it's an emotional reaction to, wait, I'm not going to be able to drive my car anymore and that kind of stuff. But that's not true, really, because when you diminish a lane or take away city parking to add a bike lane, the numbers actually increase for local businesses. They actually become more profitable because they spend more money because they're actually traveling through the neighborhood at a slower pace. And then when you add on top of that, the cost for construction of highway, a single lane of a bike lane is $250,000 on average. And then the return to taxpayers is almost 240% on stuff like that.
Yeah, those investments work. A good way to think about it is if you and I were neighbors, Chris, and we got up in the morning and each of us decided to ride our bicycle to work that day, there would be 2 less cars on the road. There'd be 2 less cars at that stop sign in our neighborhood that another car might have to wait behind. And so as more people get out of their cars and they get onto bikes or taking public transit or walking, it's significantly reducing the amount of cars and the congestion that's on the road. And it's really sort of the only way out of it. You can build more roads, you can build more lanes, you can have faster speed limits. It's never actually going to reduce the congestion unless you're creating opportunities for people to drive less. In Boise, the average household takes about 10 vehicle trips per year. Not per year, per day. 10 vehicle trips per day. If you took 10 per year, we'd be doing pretty good. So the average household takes 10 vehicle trips per day. And when we're trying to talk about actually getting people out of their cars, we're not actually saying we need to remove every single one of those trips, but think if the average was 5 or 6 instead of 10. That's really when you're starting to reduce the amount of cars that are on the road, improving the air quality, reducing congestion, and doing all these different types of things that are going to have a positive benefit for everyone. And so, we're asking, and we have to design cities that way too, where people don't necessarily have to take every single trip by car. And so that means making sure that our neighborhoods have, a coffee shop, a brewery, a restaurant, some of these basic types of things, parks where you can walk to. And so there's a design aspect to it, but it really is something that we have to think about with our roads, that if our long-term goal is to maintain the status quo of traffic jams or keep them, minimized, then you can kind of keep doing what you're doing. But if you actually want to reduce and you want to improve people's commute times for cars, the best thing that you can do is try to figure out how you can get half of the people out of their cars and into another mode of transportation. And there will be some people, for all sorts of different reasons, that will never have the opportunity to ride a bike because of how far away they work. It could have something to do with a disability or a variety of other different circumstances. And so we need to make sure that that's something that's still there. But by somebody who has the ability to choose to ride a bike, it's helping everybody out in the process.
Yeah, that's so well said, because I think the issue isn't getting everyone out of their cars. The issue is getting some of us out of our cars, because there are inherently going to be people who are disabled or they have gigs that they just can't drive. They just are unable to. But when you put into the factor that we just can't keep expanding roads, especially in the older cities, like I'm in Philadelphia right now visiting family. This city's been here for a long time. There are very few options for expanding any of the roads in Philadelphia. There's nowhere to go, no matter if you wanted them or not. But what they've chosen to do is Philly's on the level with like Portland and Boulder and Boise. They're going down the road of creating bike paths out of old train tracks that are no longer being used. They're trying to connect the city. And when I was in Nashville, I spent 25 years in Nashville. They had done an amazing job connecting about 60 miles worth of greenway through the city that you could get from one side of the city to the other without having to get on more than 1 mile of surface road. My curiosity is just with guys like you who are in the position and doing it every day. Do you see it? Do you see having an effect? Do you see it becoming easier, or is post-pandemic, is your job becoming harder?
It's probably both. You bring up a really good example in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia has a large population of people who choose to ride their bicycle, and then it has a really large population of people who have no other transportation options. And Philadelphia has done a really good job with some of the railroads and some of the canal access roads. So the maintenance roads that run along irrigation canals, of putting some bikeways that are on there. The reality for both of those types of people, both who choose to ride and who have no other transportation options, is that about 60% of them, they want to ride their bicycle more for some of their trips, but they're too concerned about the safety issues of riding in the street. And that's going to amplify even more if you're talking about somebody riding with children, or riding with maybe somebody who's elderly, a variety of different types of things. And so you have to be creating infrastructure for that 60% of people that make them feel comfortable getting to the places where they need to go, where they don't feel like they're putting their life or their kid's life in danger. And so I'm part of a different group of cyclists that they would call a little bit more on the fearless side, where we've ridden so often, we're so comfortable riding in traffic that there's not too many roads that are really going to scare us, and we're going to ride our bicycle no matter what. If you were to continue building roads designed for folks like me, you're not going to get people on bikes. But if you really design around those 60% of people who really want to ride but they're concerned, then you start seeing infrastructure that truly gets people riding, like those trails that you mentioned in Philadelphia, like those people that you mentioned in, like our Dutch cycling, in places like Copenhagen, where they actually have infrastructure that separates people, from the dangerous automobiles. The hard thing that we have here in just about every single state in America that a lot of other places don't is that while infrastructure continues to get better, cars also continue to get more dangerous. So you can think about, the size of your F-150 pickup truck that just came out last week compared to that same F-150 that came out, in the 80s or the 70s, how much bigger it is, how much higher that bumper is, where it's potentially going to hit somebody if it contacts them rather than in the legs, hitting them like in the chest area. So we live in a country where speed limits continue to get faster and cars continue to get bigger. And we're investing in good infrastructure at the same time. So we're doing something good, but there's other things that we really have to address when it comes to safety. And the other issue that we really see in Boise and everywhere else is that the infrastructure isn't really distributed equitably. So the communities who have more political sway, who are more connected, who have more time, whose biggest problem is that people drive too fast through their neighborhood, not that they don't have a way to pick up their kids after school because they're working two jobs, or that they're worried about getting food on the plate. These places that have a lot of these bigger issues are actually the people who have little and sometimes no other transportation options. They might be a one-car family or a no-car family, and they're the places that really lack the type of infrastructure that's needed to allow them to commute safely. So as cities, one of the things that we have to do is to make sure that when we're looking at these investments, whether those are canal pathways, railroad tracks, better infrastructure that's on the street, we really need to be looking at the places where there's gaps in that infrastructure, not in just the places that have it. Because if you're looking at data, you would say, oh, this area of town rides a lot, so we need to invest more infrastructure because they've got the data and the numbers to back it up. But then if you really looked at that more, you would say, oh, the reason that they're riding more is because they already have this infrastructure. And if we really want to create that change, we need to be looking in these areas where people have less of ability or feel like they're in danger to ride, so that we can get those numbers up in those places too.
Because safety is the biggest impediment with changing the mindset, correct? Most people, like you said, is about 60% of riders state that the reason they don't ride to work is because of the safety issue, and that inherently goes to the city infrastructure and stuff. So in cities like Philadelphia and Chicago and stuff. In Chicago, you have the weather. Even in Philly and New York, you have the weather becomes an impediment. But could you make more headway in rural areas, say in Iowa, to do it there first and then bring it into the other cities? Or does it make sense to concentrate your efforts in like a city like Miami or a city like Dallas or Houston, and then use that as the example to propel this argument forward that this can work if we, the money is there, we just need to reallocate it more correctly?
Yeah, it's certainly easier to do it in those rural areas because they've got all the space in the world to do it. So when they're going through and then they're resurfacing the road or repainting stripes on the road, they've got a large amount of real estate to actually create high quality infrastructure. And in a lot of these rural areas, some of them you can think of like a highway is there also their main street, that runs through the middle of the town. You've got people that are going really fast through their neighborhoods, but they're also, pretty walkable by the time that you get from like the school to the library to the grocery store. And so there's a lot of aspects where making those cities walkable and bikeable can be just as game changing in these sort of urban areas. But I still think those urban areas are where you're going to start to find the benefits of the most numbers, because you'll start to figure out ways to combine trips. So if you can combine a bicycle ride with a bus ride, or a bicycle ride with mass transit or a light rail system or different things along there, then you're actually being able to use a bicycle to get across town just as fast as a car. And you mentioned something earlier, it's safety, but it's also safety and convenience. So if you can make it just as convenient or more convenient to ride your bicycle than it is to drive, that's when you'll see a lot of changes. And you see this in urban areas where people ride their bikes because it's easier to park their bike than it is to park their car, and cheaper to park their bike than it is to park their car. So that's a convenience factor. So if we start to figure out what the other things are that we can add to the convenience levels of riding a bicycle and making it more, and usually that's like better bicycle parking, covered bicycle parking, having like public pumps and different things along like that, businesses that can, put, showers or different types of facilities, inside their businesses that make it a little bit easier. You start to actually make it easier and more convenient to bike than it is to drive. And when that starts to flip, that's really, I think, when people will make those decisions, the safety and the convenience at the same time. And there's so many things that you can do in both of those aspects as far as investments go. But when businesses, the nice thing as an elected official is that when businesses start asking for those things, that's where some of the money is. And so businesses have a really large potential to play huge advocacy roles in getting this type of infrastructure. And it's typically really good for their business as well. From a recruitment standpoint, people want to live in bicycle-friendly cities. They want to work at bicycle-friendly businesses. Employees who ride their bikes to work tend to get sick a lot less, tend to be healthier overall, tend to arrive to work happier, tend to get home, to their families a lot happier at the end of the day. So it makes a lot of business sense. And when business starts to drive these decisions, it makes it really easy, I think, for elected officials and for people who are operating and governing our roads to make those types of investments, because they're the ones who are also would be the ones complaining about parking going away. And so if you sort of flip the script, you're able to make a lot of big change.
And that's a great point, because in going back to the Netherlands, which we keep reverting back to that, but it's such a great example. I mean, over the last 20 years, they've built over 500,000 bicycle parking spaces, and over 650,000 people per day use the train bike combination to get to work or get to do their errands. And that's the one beautiful thing that I think a lot of these urban areas already have is in Chicago, in Philly, we already have subways and trains, and we already have that. We just kind of got to do a better job with allowing bicycles and finding a place to put those on there to make it easier for people who want to bring their bike to work. And then the businesses, as you said, there are countless examples, like the company that makes Cliff Bars and Osprey backpacks and all these companies. They are on the forefront of encouraging their employees to get to work by bike. And they also have all that supportive, they have bike tools. I mean, I was just in Bentonville, Arkansas on the way driving across, and Bentonville is, famous for the home of Walmart. And this was a little tiny town that Walmart was considering moving out of because they had outgrown it. And I went through there 3 weeks ago, and the entire city has been redone, because instead of moving and spending the millions of dollars it would take to move the Walmart headquarters, they finally had someone inside the company say, why don't we just reinvest it into Bentonville and make this an area? So they did the airport, they started building mountain bike trails, and now they've acquired the monicum of the mountain bike capital of the world. They're building, the entire town is bike paths, and there were 5 bike shops I went into, and every one of them was a different bike shop catering to either electric bikes for commuters with kids. They had bikes for 3. There was a mountain bike thing, but my biggest point was the bike lanes were brand new and painted. There were crossroads. There were ways to get around the whole town, and each corner of a major intersection where the bikes were had coffee shops, cafes. It was impressive. I was blown away that in front of every cafe is a huge bike rack. There's 5 or 6 bikes in it. The sidewalks are painted. All of the curbs have been chiseled at the corners so you can just ride up and down. It's incredible what can really happen and transform. That city is like hopping on bikes.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to make those investments and hard to convince people to make those investments. But then usually what you see is that once they're in place, um, people would lose their minds if you would try to take them away.
Exactly.
So it was hard to convince them to get it in the first place. But now that it's there, people, they grow attached to it. We have this thing in Boise, the Boise Greenbelt, 50 miles of pathway that runs along the Boise River. And when it was installed 50 years ago, it was one of the most controversial projects that the city had ever gone in. There were people who were showing up at city council meetings, throwing tomatoes at the city council member, like a cartoon or like an old, movie that you can think of. This was happening 50 years ago. And people thought it was going to be impossible. It was going to destroy the city. It was going to do all these different types of things. And now it's widely considered sort of like the crown jewel of the city. It's something that if we were going to try to take away right now, like people would burn City Hall down if we were going to make any sort of attempt to do it. And so sometimes those investments are really, really hard to make. Once they're there and those benefits start to happen, which usually takes a little bit of time, people become incredibly attached to them. And it's sort of that idea again that feeling of loss has gone away. And the change that they experience actually ended up being a positive change. And so if we can help people get past that fear of loss and get to look and say like, no, there's actually some benefits here. So let's focus on those as well. And then we can figure out which outweigh the other. A lot of times we can make those investments a little bit more. There's one thing, I will bring up. I think that there's another important role that bikes play beyond just sort of the impact on the city. It's really the impact that we have when we interact with each other. And I talk about this a little bit in my TED Talk, especially during the pandemic where we became more isolated from each other and we got into our own groups or our own pods. We really sort of stopped interacting with each other as a community. And when we first started getting out, you would get next to people and it would feel uncomfortable. And you wouldn't quite know how to interact with people when you'd go to a coffee shop, even though they were friends of yours. Well, when we drive in our automobiles, we sort of do the same thing all the time. You're sort of in this box that separates you from the person that's next to you on the street, whether that person's in a car or if they're standing on the side of the road. And our experiences with each other, our interactions, they aren't really in a way that we would behave in any other circumstance. We're sort of our worst selves oftentimes when we're behind a car trying to get to work or trying to get to these other places. And I use this example in my TED Talk. But I was driving in my car, which I still do, and I was riding past somebody who was experiencing homelessness, and they had a sign that they were holding up, a cardboard sign that they had painted. And in my car, like I started to begin this absolutely ridiculous internal dialogue of how should I interact with this person? Should I ignore them? Should I focus on my driving? Should I do all these different types of things? And just this ongoing dialogue that I've had multiple times, and I know other people do the exact same thing. And then the very next day at that same intersection, that same person was there, and I was on my bicycle, and I rolled up to the person, and I said, "Hey, how's it going?" Just as if it's another human being, which they are, on the street. And when you separate people with a glass box, a big, huge vehicle, and the speeds that go with it, you start to really get rid of those human interactions. And I think that that's a really important part of bicycling that people miss out on, is that those human interactions are important. That person who's experiencing homelessness on the side of the street, it might be 20 degrees out that day. And when you're standing next to them, when you're out of your car, you start to understand a little bit more of what this person might be experiencing. It also opens up the opportunity for a potential conversation or a better understanding, of each other. And that shared space is really, really important. And we lose that when we're in our vehicles, and we get that back when we get out. And that, I think, is really one of my favorite parts about riding my bike, is the interactions that I have with people along the way. Maybe sometimes it's with animals, maybe it's with kids who are like walking to school that I can wave to. It's a variety of different things that I feel more in touch with my community. And I think right now, post-pandemic, that's something that we should all be trying to think about, is how can we be more in touch with our community, and not just the people that we are used to, that we agree with 100% of the time, but actually share space as a community, and have those real human interactions.
So well said. It is imperative that we make those connections again, because with the situation going on in America and I mean just all over the world, the tendency is to withdraw, right? But in I read something many years ago that I don't remember who said it, but when you're feeling the need to withdraw from something, the better action is to plug in harder, just push into it harder. And I spend most of my year in Baja, which I know you're familiar with. Baja, you did a sailing trip down there, which could be an entire episode on its own. And we'll put the link to that story in the show notes. But I rode my bicycle from down the Baja Divide,
Oh, cool.
which is an incredible mountain trail, 1,500 miles. And the reason I did it was for the people, the interaction that post-COVID, I rode through the smallest mountain villages and saw people with the least to give, and they gave it freely. Traveling on the bicycle resets your psyche in a way that is, I don't think, attainable in any other way other than either trekking or you walking across the world. Anything that slows you down to the point where you have to physically interact with the universe you're walking through. And I think, to your point on the TED Talk, which I loved so much, is that interaction that I've sat in my car and done the same thing on a corner. Do I make eye contact? I feel embarrassed or shameful because I'm not going to donate because I don't have cash. Or you go through this whole psychological process in your head that if you're on a bicycle or if you're walking, you just don't have any other choice but to treat that person as a human being, right? You're going to graze it, and you're going to have that interaction. And that, in addition to the health benefits, but I think as you interact with your community, that too is a health benefit. That's a positive mental image and positive stuff that you're putting in your head. So it's all, to me, an incredible benefit.
Yeah, those interactions are really beautiful experiences, because it means that you're kind of both growing with each other at the same time, and you're both benefiting from that experience. So there's really an exchange that's going on there. When I'm on my bicycle, there's something that is just so interesting to people when they see someone on a bike, that they want to know what's going on. They're a little fascinated. I think that they're a little bit jealous of the adventure. They kind of look at that and they say, oh, I would like to do something like that. Or I did something like that when I was a younger kid. But I was riding across Oregon. This is after I did the TED Talk. And I was going from Boise to the Oregon coast. And I was driving down this Highway 20, which is one of the longest highways in the country. And you go about 50 to 60 miles between towns. And so in between the towns, there's nothing. There's no water. It's a pretty deserty area. I'd driven the stretch 100 different times. And usually it's a stretch that you drive through pretty fast, because you're like, it's not even pretty outside. It's just bare desert. And when I was on my bike, that stretch completely transformed. I was starting to see, birds of prey, on the posts along the way. There was this weird town where I stopped at this gas station. It's the only gas station in 100 miles of either direction. And, the person bought me a Coors Original at the bar and, asked if I needed a trip to my next or a lift to the next spot. It's like, no, I actually like riding my bike. And he's like, well, let me show you where this secret swimming hole is. And so in the middle of this desert, he showed me where this swimming hole is that has a, wooden plank diving board that I jumped off of, that is the same wooden plank diving board that this guy's grandpa jumped off of when he was younger. And this guy spent his entire life living in this tiny little town in the middle of Eastern Oregon. And had I not been on my bicycle, which was sort of this invitation for him to start asking me questions, I wouldn't have had that experience from him.
Nice.
And throughout the conversation, it became very clear that we differed a lot politically, some of our views on COVID. But I began to sort of understand why he kind of felt and thought some of those things. And we were also able to put a lot of those things aside and again, connect to each other as human beings and kind of understand that, like, hey, we disagree on some stuff and that's actually okay. But what's more important is the humanity that we can exchange with each other. And again, I've never experienced that with anything else quite like the way that I do on my bicycle. So it seems like this sort of magical thing that's going to make invite the community to interact with you in really kind of cool and beautiful ways.
I truly agree 100%. It is a magical thing. And I had the same experience because I feel like when you arrive into a town on a bicycle, you are the least threatening creature out there because people look at you and they say, oh, this poor fella, what the hell is he doing? But then, and they also have the other aspect where, or they say, oh my God, that's so cool. And it immediately gives them an in to a dialogue. Where did you come from? Where are you going? Why are you doing this? And I found the same thing on our sailboat. It all socioeconomics, all political, whatever. It vanished when you pulled in on a sailboat because you don't know if the dude on the next boat is a brain surgeon, a lawyer, or destitute. The first question is, where did you come from? Where are you going? And then you start talking about boats, and the rest of the world is ancillary. It's the what is important is you're traveling and you have this commonality that you arrived by boat, he arrived by boat, and that's what connects you. And then I find when I'm riding a bicycle,
Yep.
the same fascination that you had, people pulled over. I had countless people pull over on the car in there when I went into these little Mexican towns, and one dude jumped out, scared the hell out of me, jumped out, pulled over, almost hit me with his car, and took out his phone and said, I was 350 pounds when COVID hit. And what I did was I got a bicycle, and now he was like 190, but he was this beautiful Mexican dude. He hugged me like he was going to crack my spine. And he was like, I'm going to ride this trail one day. And he showed me, it was beautiful. And I had countless experiences like that, and they are priceless. And I know we're getting to the end and I got to let you go, but I want to say that none of this is kind of new for you because your grandfather, this is kind of in your blood, right? Al Larson, they called him the Bluebird Man. He was instrumental in conservation and awareness, right? This comes through the whole Hallyburton line.
I'll share that story really quick. And I'm glad that you brought up the sailing thing because there are lots of different ways where we can slow down the world and kind of foster those real interactions. For me, the bicycle is a wonderful tool that's really worked for me. For you, it's sailing. For my grandpa, it was something different. My grandpa, who's 100 years old, alive today, he's doing really
Excellent.
well. He, at about 50 years old, and he had served in the military in World War II, in the Korean War. He'd been a miner. He'd been a logger. He'd had like a pretty tough, pretty just like tough and adventurous and heroic life. At 50 years old, he decided after reading a National Geographic article that he was going to help save the bluebird population. Bluebirds were on decline. They're second cavity dwellers, so they make homes in the holes that other woodpeckers and other animals make. And because starlings, a non-native species, had got introduced, bluebirds were being outcompeted. And so they were going extinct. And he saw this, and for whatever reason, he decided, this is going to be something that I'm going to help solve. And he didn't do it by going and complaining to somebody or demanding anything. He did it by building a bluebird box, and then he hung it up. And then he built another one, and then he hung it up, and he built another one, and so on and so forth. And I think over the course of 50 years, he's hung up over, I think it's something like 10,000 bluebird boxes. He's banded over, I think 50 or 60,000 like baby bluebirds, and as a citizen scientist got his banding license. And he hung these boxes up all over Idaho. He went out and monitored them, counted the eggs, measured the wings, could see if birds were coming back, what type of year they were coming back. And he did this for 50 years and compiled the largest amount of bluebird research that's ever been compiled before. And is widely known as sort of the Bluebird Man. There's this great documentary about him called The Bluebird Man. But in the process of doing that, he also found evidence of how climate change was affecting bird migration patterns, and was one of the earlier people to really identify that as a citizen scientist. And so he was always so motivating to me because here's a person who, when they saw a problem, decided that, hey, I'm going to get my hands dirty and solve it. And in the second half of their life, found their purpose, found their thing that allowed them to connect with other community members, found a way to be more in touch with nature and find some peace in a life that didn't really have a lot of peace in its earlier history. And so I think that that's out there for everybody, and people can kind of figure out what that is for them. What is the thing that's going to help you slow down and connect with the world around you a little bit more? what is the thing that's going to let you actually get your hands dirty and do something besides post about it on social media?
Amen.
Or write a letter? What's the thing that's actually going to allow you to get involved with the change and allow you to feel part of that purpose? Earlier in this interview, I think you mentioned that I went on to city council during a really, really hard time when the pandemic started. And it was a really hard time, and I'm still running Boise Bicycle Project and on city council at the same time, so sort of two full-time jobs. I can't imagine what my life would have been like had I not been in either one of those positions, because I was still in a spot where I could be part of trying to solve the problem or create solutions or try to make sure that the people who were being affected by the pandemic the most, that I was in touch with them and bringing their voices to the table. And so I was in a really, really rare spot where I had the ability to create change while other people were stuck at home. And so it was really, really hard, but I feel really, really lucky that I got to be part of trying to come up with the solutions to these problems. And I think that what people will find is that when they find whatever that problem is that they want to solve, it starts to become a little bit addictive, because you find that purpose and that feeling. And maybe it's work related, maybe it's not work related, maybe it's the hobby on the side, like my grandpa who started building these Bluebird boxes. But once you start feeling that, hey, I can actually create some change and do something positive, it becomes something that is hard to get away from after that. So I feel really lucky to be in both positions that I am, the executive director of the Boise Bicycle Project and the team that made so much impact, kept kids on their bicycles, kept people connected to the community during the pandemic, and kept kind of the programs going. And then also being on city council where we can make sure that we're investing in communities to make better change going forward. I feel really lucky.
Well, I feel really lucky to have discovered you, and I think we're all lucky that you're there too. So thanks for your service and what you do, and I'm going to let you go. But before I do, is there anything that you're working on that excites you, or tell people where they can find you? Of course, the Boise Bicycle Project.org, O-R-G, is that correct?
Yeah, BoiseBicycleProject.org is a great place, and Boise Bicycle Project is on Instagram. I'm on Instagram on Jimmy Hallyburton as well. And I try to post a lot about my bicycle trips that are on there, and I try to show people that you can do it on any type of bike, wearing any type of clothing,
Yep.
No matter where you live, and just trying to make it a little bit more accessible. That's really sort of one of my goals, is to like uncomplicate the aspect of riding a bike. You need a bike, you need a pair of jeans, and you need a t-shirt, and you can go out and go for a ride, and that's enough to get started. And you may find that you want to make some changes down the road, but I really want to make sure that people know that like just go out there and get involved and kind of get started. As far as things that I'm excited about, I'm really excited at the Bike Project right now that we've got new programs that are helping the kids that we serve not only get bicycles, not only learn how to fix their own bikes, but actually get employable bicycle mechanic skills, both at the Boise Bicycle Project and at other bicycle shops here in the Valley. I think my ultimate dream for BBP is that one day it's ran by the executive director is somebody who's actually benefited from one of our programs, who knows what life-changing impact a bicycle could make and would have the ability to communicate that in another way. And we're really trying hard to make sure that we're generating pathways towards leadership within our community, within BBP. And that's, I think, one of the most exciting things for me to think about is, who are going to be our future leaders, and how can I, as an elected official and the executive director of BBP, open those doors for those future leaders to find solutions to problems that you and I can't.
Incredible. Great stuff, Jimmy. Great stuff. We'll have all your links to Instagram and all that stuff in the show notes. And I can't thank you enough for taking your time out of your day. I know you're incredibly busy with everything you got on to speak to us here. And I know people are going to love this conversation, and I'm thrilled to have it because I think it's important. And I just feel like championing people like you is imperative to move the dialogue forward and move the needle. So thank you again for your time, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And no matter where people live or where they're listening to this, there's a strong chance that there's something similar to the Boise Bicycle Project in their own area. Philadelphia has an awesome one. I think it's called Philadelphia Bike Works that I visited the last time that I was there. So the things that we're doing here in Boise are going on all around the world. So just look up a nonprofit bicycle shop wherever you're at, and you can jump into your own community, figure out how you can help get some more people on bicycles.
Yeah, man, get down there, get in, get your hands dirty, go visit these people. They could probably use your help. And I always tell people, wherever you live, you don't have to ride 1,000 miles on a bicycle.
Yep.
You can go out and ride around the block. There's always something probably within 2 miles of your house that's begging to be discovered. So it's just about getting involved. So yeah, reach out to any of the local establishments that are trying to do stuff like this and see if they need a hand, because the chances are they could use your help. So thank you again, brother. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, thanks for listening. If you like what you're hearing, make sure to subscribe or follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And do me a favor, share it, tell your friends, because the show doesn't go anywhere without you. We drop new episodes every Wednesday. If you want to listen to back episodes or find out how to support the show, you can do both at themindunset.com. Next week, I'm flying solo. Hope you come back for that. And until then, be nice. Do good stuff.